Good morning. It's a very beautiful day outside and spring-like weather for this afternoon, so that's all good. Ned, would you word a prayer for us as we begin our class?
Dear most loving Heavenly Father, Lord, we're so thankful for this beautiful Lord's Day that we have to come out this morning and to fellowship one with another and learn more about your word. We pray, Lord, that you'll be with us this morning, that we'll be able to apply what's taught to us to our lives. We can let our lives shine more for you as an example for you. Pray at this time, Lord, for the world that we live in and the conflict that's going on in Russia and Ukraine. We pray for all those folks that are involved with that. We pray, Lord, that you'll be with our nation. Pray, Lord, that there will be peace in our land at some point in time. We thank you, Lord, for your Son Jesus who came to this world and was the perfect example of that on the cross for our sin. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Appreciate Ned's prayer with regard to the situation that we find ourselves in. The more I learn about history, the more I contemplate history and so forth, the more I'm convinced that if we didn't have leaders, we wouldn't have so many wars. Because it's the egos of leaders that cause wars. And we've seen it in our lifetime, and we just need to have less leaders in this world and let people get along. We're going to do something phenomenal this morning, at least for me. We're going to cover chapters 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48 of Ezekiel. Now we're going to move quickly through that exercise, and we're just going to focus on kind of the general theme of each chapter. And the details, it would take as we've said before, it would take an awful long time to decipher what each detail in these chapters mean in terms of the New Testament, the New Covenant. Now, we know that these chapters about the design of the temple and all that follows, we know that that's literal, or that's not literal, that's figurative, it's symbolic, and it to some extent refers to the Jews coming back to Jerusalem, but it primarily has to do with the New Covenant. As we think about the New Covenant relationship with Ezekiel, when we look at this material, it's just hard to imagine that this has anything to do, the restoration of the temple has anything to do with the Jewish temple when they came back to Jerusalem from the captivity. The description of the temple here, as we saw last week, doesn't fit the pattern, particularly of this temple that Solomon built, and certainly it doesn't fit the pattern of the temple that was rebuilt after they came back from Babylonian captivity. Some of the older folks, when they dedicated the temple, some of the older folks that had seen the first temple, the Solomon's temple, weep because it wasn't nearly as elaborate as the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonian folks. Now, in chapter 43 of Ezekiel, we find God entering into Jerusalem area by the east gate. Now, if we go back to the 10th chapter of Ezekiel, we see God departing from the temple and from Jerusalem. Now, the context there was that Ezekiel was transported in a vision. His mind was transported in a vision to Jerusalem, and that original narrative is described in the 10th chapter of Ezekiel, and it has to do with God departing from the temple. Now, I'm quite confident that Ezekiel was to give this message to the people that he was ministering to, back when God departed from the temple. And it was a very, it would have been a very somber, a very a sad message that he had to give to those captives, and I suppose that it was maybe it had the effect of some of penitence on the part of some of those folks. They may have come to realize that that God had it with them, that God was punishing them because of their transgressions. But it was a very sad message, I'm sure. If we go to the 10th chapter of Ezekiel, and in that 10th chapter, this vision that Ezekiel had to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. First of all, the sins of Jerusalem, and the prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, and God departing from the temple in Jerusalem. And the vision that he had was quite like, in terms of God's presence, or the identification of God's presence, was like the first chapter of Ezekiel, where the presence of God was indicated by a very complicated scene, a very complicated creature, or a very complicated something. Well, now, and he sees this same, he sees that God is identified through this vision. And then he says there, in beginning with verse 15 of Ezekiel 10, he says, "And the cherubims were lifted up," and this is that vision that he had about the presence of God. And this living creature, so he calls it a living creature, this is the living creature that I saw by the river of Kebor, then the first chapter, you see. And when the cherubims went, the wheels went with them, and when the cherubims lifted up their wings to mount up from the earth, the same wheels also turned not from beside them. Verse 17, when they stood, and when they were lifted up, these lifted up themselves after, for the spirit of the living creature was in them. That the glory of the Lord, then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over by the cherubims, and stood over the cherubims. And the cherubims lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight. And when they went out, the wheels also were beside them. And every one stood at the door of the east gate. Now we're going in our chapter today, we're going to, in the 43rd chapter, we're going to see this east gate. Stood up at the door of the east gate, the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them above. So, this living creature had to do with a demonstration, an illustration, a symbol of God's presence there. This is the living creature in verse 20 that I saw under the God of Israel by the river Kebor, and I knew that they were cherubims. Everyone had 4 faces apiece, and everyone 4 wings. and the likeness of the hands of a man was under their wings. And the likeness of their faces was the same faces which I saw by the river Kibar. Their appearance themselves, they went every one straight forward. And the message there was God had departed from the temple. Now think about those captives there. They were in captivity, and most of them probably had no hope of ever, returning to Jerusalem. Those that would want to had no hope of returning to Jerusalem, had no hope of worshiping again in a temple in Jerusalem, because Ezekiel had given the message to them that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, the temple was going to be destroyed. It was, a message of doom and gloom. So they were no doubt a discouraged people, and particularly when they were told that God had departed from the temple, which means that the temple was not any longer to be protected. So they must have been, without hope. Now, I don't know whether any of you ever have thought about, no hope. I've never been in a situation. I've been very fortunate in my lifetime. I've never been in a situation where I didn't have hope, whether it be in this life or the next life. A lot of people have no hope. The reason there are a lot of corruption and murders in Chicago, being kind of, every day, every night, there's scores of people murdered. And in those communities, probably most people really have no hope. And that's a sad situation, to be in a situation where you're working with a group of kids that have an idea that they're not going to live. They're in a community situation where they're not going to live to get a job. They're going to be killed. Now, how do you teach? How do you minister in that kind of situation? Well, I suppose Ezekiel, when he was delivering that message of no hope, I suppose they were really, really discouraged. Well, now, if we then go to his next vision of Jerusalem and so on, 43rd chapter, and afterwards he brought me to the gate, even the gate that was looked toward the east. There's the same gate. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. And his voice was like a noise of many waters. And the earth shined with his glory. And it was according to the appearance of the vision which I saw, even according to the vision. Let me read that over. And it was according to the appearance of the vision which I saw, even according to the vision that I saw when I came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the visions that I saw by the river of Kibar. And I fell upon my face. So he connected here. Ezekiel's connecting those visions in chapter 1 and chapter 10 and with this one. And it was according to the appearance of the vision which I saw, even according to the vision that I saw when I came to destroy the city, and the visions were like the vision that I saw by the river Kibar. And I fell upon my face, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate, whose prospect is toward the east. Now, so here's the glory of the Lord appearing. Verse 5, so the Spirit took me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. Remember in the previous vision, the glory of the Lord departed from the house. And I heard him speaking, verse 6 again, and I heard him speaking unto me out of the house, and the man stood by me. Now, remember when Ezekiel's, the first part of his vision there, this vision, there was a man that led him around. Now, some commentators or some scholars believe that that man was a representation of Jesus in human form. Others believe it was an angel that was leading him around. I'll leave that up to you to decide. In verse 7, and he said unto me, Son of man, the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever, and my holy name shall be the house of Israel, no more defiled, neither they nor the kings by their whoredom, nor by the carcasses of their kings and their high places. Now, we'll stop right there and think about this. When he says, when he talks about that he will not depart from them, if this had to do with the temple, the permanence of the temple, then why did God allow or God destroy the temple in AD 70 in the city, you see? So he's got to be talking about New Testament era things. And just reading a little further on, let's read that again. And he said unto me, Son of man, the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever. And my holy name shall be the house of Israel. That is the Christian community, the kingdom community, the eternal kingdom, the one that was established on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2. Neither they nor their kings nor their whoredom, nor by the carcasses of their kings in their high places, in the settings of their threshold, by my thresholds, and their post by my post, and the wall between me and them, they have even defiled my holy name by their abominations that they have committed. Wherefore I have consumed them in my anger. Now, this is the message that this message of hope was flavored by the fact that God had destroyed Jerusalem, had destroyed the temple, because of their corruptions. Verse 10, Thou son of man, show the house to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed. Now he's going to preach. He said, now you preach this, you let the house of Israel know this, and let them measure the pattern. And if they be ashamed of all that they have done, show them the form of the house, and the fashion thereof, and the goings out thereof, and comings in thereof, and all the forms thereof, and all the ordinance thereof, and all the forms thereof. And so on. Well, so the point, I think the important point in chapter 43 is that God's presence is restored to Israel. Now, whether Ezekiel really understood all of this or not, I certainly don't know. Whether the people to whom he preached, whether they were of the, I don't think they could have understood the spiritual intent of all of this. They wouldn't have had, they wouldn't have had being a race of people that God had protected and nurtured as a nation. Would they have had any grasp of a spiritual kingdom that was different from their national presence? Tim, help me understand that, would you? Would they?
Probably not.
They probably just.
They would have just been thinking about a restoration of the
Yeah.
nation of Israel.
But it gave them hope. This message would have given them hope. Now, what of the people that he preached to, what percentage of them do you suppose really were interested in that? Did they all return to Jerusalem? No. In the Persian Empire, were there Jews scattered among the 127 or 129 provinces? Yeah, at the time of Esther. Many of those people were not interested in, becoming, part of a restoration of Jerusalem. Well, so that's kind of where we are there. Well, chapter 44. That has to do with Ezekiel being taken to the outer east gate. And the outer east gate was permanently locked. God entered in, and then God locked the gate. Now, what does that tell us? Think about what that tells us. If the gate's locked, then humankind isn't going to come in, right? God's sacredness, comparing to humanity, humanity wasn't worthy, you see. However, through the sacrifice of Christ in the New Kingdom, in the Kingdom era, the New Testament era, mankind can be made righteous because of the blood of Christ. Is that right? So, now, I'm sure most of the folks wouldn't have understood that principle. But at the same time that the blood of Christ can make mankind righteous, mankind needs to know his or her place, right? Now, let's think about that. Because a person is made righteous by the blood of Christ, does that give mankind license to change anything that God has ordained? does that give mankind any license to add to Scripture or develop a new set of Scriptures? And obviously the answer is no. But it's something for, I think there may be several messages there with regard to God entering that east gate and it being locked. And any thoughts that any of you have with regard to that issue or with that matter? Any thoughts whatsoever? Okay. Well, let's look at chapter 44 then in terms of an outline. The first verses 1 through 3. The gate is closed. Verse 4 to 9. Laws pertaining to worship. In the New Testament era, in the era of grace, is there law? Well, sure, certainly. In verses 10 through 14, talks about the Levites being punished. Now, I don't know what that implications that has for the kingdom. But then in the last part of chapter 44, it identifies laws regarding the priests. Now, who are the priests in the kingdom? Well, we know that. We've been told about the priesthood of believers. Well, then, fast forwarding then to chapter 45. Chapter 45, the emphasis on the priest. There's emphasis about the priest and the Levites. Verses 1 through 8 talks about the maintenance of the priest, and they identified the territory that the priest would be privy to. In verses 9 through 12 of chapter 45, the emphasis there is that integrity is demanded of the leaders, and integrity was demanded of the leaders. Sinful leadership was not to be tolerated. Now, I said earlier, if it weren't for leaders, there might be some. I'm talking about leaders of nations. There might be more peace on earth, but there's a real onus on leaders to be to lack corruption. There's a real onus on leaders to be a good example, but that doesn't happen. And I think Lincoln had it right when he talked about power corrupting. That power sometimes, or oftentimes, maybe most of the times, corrupts the people, the leaders. Then in verses 13 to 17, there's an offering has about offerings, as is the case with regard to there's some discussion of priests there. Then let's then fast forward to 46, chapter 46. The first 18 verses there have to do with a lot of minute or a lot of specific, detailed instruction about the moon, Sabbaths, the new moons, various holidays, so to speak, feast days, and the approach. And in his vision, he approaches the east gate, but of course that east gate is closed. Then there is in 19 through the rest of the chapter there, in the 46th chapter, he talks about this prince and possibly the person that was touring him around in this vision around Jerusalem. He talks about him and and this is kind of minutiae, but it talks about the cooking places for the sacred meals, and all has to do with rituals. Chapter 47, there's a vision of water flowing out of the temple and through the city and to, as my understanding is, here to the Dead Sea. Now, as Ezekiel approaches this water that's leaving the city, first of all, it's kind of up to his ankles, and then eventually it's deep enough that he would have to swim, and then it becomes so deep that it can't get across. Now, I wonder what that idea, that water going out into the desert region, and the Dead Sea is the lowest spot on the earth, the lowest elevation on the earth, and the Dead Sea is. Anybody ever been to the Dead Sea? Well, Meadows has been to the Dead, but he's not here. The Dead Sea, it's a desert region. But in this vision, the river flows, vegetation, trees on each side of the river, fruitful trees, and what do you suppose that? Suppose that has anything? Do you think Jesus might have had some reference? Was thinking about that when he talked about being living water. This water that flowed made the desert come alive with fruits, so that's chapter 47. In fact, as you look at that in detail, and we're not going to get into that detail as I indicated, the river even essentially desalts the sea, the Dead Sea, makes it a living environment. Well, so chapter 47, first 12 verses, the river of life, again points to the narrative, but it's very symbolic, obviously. And if there's no historical record of any river flowing out of Jerusalem and refurbishing and replenishing the desert area. So, this is another indication that these chapters are extremely symbolic, not to be taken literally. When he saw the water coming out of the temple, that's never happened, So the streams of water, as I said, became deeper. It made a fruitful environment around about, and has great spiritual implications. So that's kind of the message in chapter 47. The message in chapter 48, but before we get to 48, there is in previous chapters, there's a in this vision of the temple and so forth, the Ark of the Covenant is left out of the vision. There are certain articles that are left out, but the altar is described. Now, what's the purpose of the altar? What was the purpose of the altar? There was a lot of description of the altar in this vision. What's the purpose of the altar? Well, that was the place of sacrifice, right? In order to worship in that era, in the Old Testament era, they sacrificed, right? There's a connection, I think, between sacrifice and worship. Now, think about that. One of the items of worship in the New Testament era is giving, right? Has to do with sacrifice. Now, that's not the only type of sacrifice that needs to be made. It's sacrifice of time, a sacrifice of various areas of life. But there was an emphasis here on the altar, the sacrifice. Now, that's a serious message, I think. That's a message that preachers convey. Don't you talk about the sacrifice? Now, can you think about this? Can you really worship without coming to the worship with a demonstration, a background, a preliminary narrative of sacrifice? That's kind of a scary thing, isn't it? That's really. Now, some religious groups say that you have to tithe. From my perspective, tithing is it's just, that really has nothing to do with, in my opinion, giving 10%. That has nothing to do. But folks need to be sacrificing. And I look at myself. Well, what have I sacrificed this week? Mark Bass was telling me about a guy in his community, remember the church there, who at 90 years old bought a $60,000 car. Now, what in the world would a 90-year-old Christian need a $60,000 car? Now, think about that. This might, again, pretty close to being judgmental, but that amount of money, think of what Jim Waldron could do with that amount of money in his working area. think about, so I think maybe that message there of the altar and sacrifice, should send the message that there should be some sacrifice connected with worship in the New Testament era. Now that's my opinion. That's just my opinion, so you can take it for what it's worth. It's his opinion. But it seems to me that there are a lot of people, including myself, that isn't making much of a sacrifice. And that could hinder our capacity to worship appropriately. Well, that's just an extra thought that you don't have to pay for. That's free of charge. And the to chapter 48 again demonstrates how that this is all figurative stuff. It's symbolic. And there we have a tribal allotment. That is, the 12 tribes, their territory was divided up, different than it was allocated in the time of Joshua. Different allocations of the territory, and that just indicates that it just demonstrates that this is highly symbolic. This whole portion of Scripture is just highly symbolic and really has nothing to do with a physical restoration there. When the Jews came back from captivity, those that came back, they didn't have, they weren't allotted certain areas like they were allotted, like the geography, the real estate was allotted among the peoples at the time of Joseph. So those are, I think, the main messages of those chapters. So I suppose you were thinking I couldn't get through those in that time allotted. That might be a message for preachers. That was a little dig there, Tim, in case you missed it.
I didn't, I caught it.
So, we're going to pause there, and we will be going into the great book of Daniel next week. That is such a wonderful book and a wonderful book to understand. So, we can be at ease there until the bell rings.